There is a moment, quiet, almost invisible, that passes before the bell is struck. The hand hovers. The mallet is still. The air hums with potential. In that pause, the world hasn't yet changed. The silence holds unbroken, and in that breath, we tell ourselves we are in control. We design lives like clockwork. Alarm at 6:30, coffee at 6:45, email, meetings, deadlines, all stacked neatly in our calendars like well-behaved bricks. We love the sensation of order, the illusion that everything will unfold according to plan, if only we hold tight enough, manage hard enough, know enough. Control, we believe, is the shelter from chaos. But beneath that architecture of precision, there is a trembling. You've felt it. The tiny dread when a meeting is cancelled unexpectedly. The twitch of discomfort when someone doesn't respond. The panic that blooms when a plan begins to unravel, even slightly. It's not about the thing itself. It's about the breaking of expectation. That fracture, no matter how small, shatters the illusion we clutch like a talisman, that life can be pinned down and made to obey. We weren't born this way. Watch a child play. Not a child rehearsing adult anxiety, but a child fully immersed in wonder. She pours water from one bowl to another, watching the way it moves. No need to contain it. No demand for outcome. No fear of what comes next. There's just the gesture, the mystery, the joy of watching something unfold. She doesn't ask the water to be predictable. She doesn't fear its spill. But something happens to us over time, we're taught, subtly, persistently, that surprises are threats, that uncertainty is weakness, that control equals power. So we build fortresses of predictability, schedules, identities, roles. We tighten, we harden, we put a white, knuckled grip on everything we can, even our own emotions, and we forget that control was never safety. It was only the story we told to feel safe. I remember sitting in my car once, parked in a lot, gripping the steering wheel like it was an anchor to reality. That morning, every plan I'd made had gone sideways. I felt betrayed by life, by people, by whatever gods were supposed to be paying attention. But mostly, I felt afraid, not of what had happened, but of what it meant that I wasn't in charge. That life was bigger than me, that anything could happen. I didn't cry, I didn't rage. I just sat there, frozen in the stillness before the bell. It's strange, the way the body responds to illusion. We tense our shoulders as if that could prevent grief. We rehearse conversations as if that could make love stay. We overthink every detail, hoping our vigilance will make us immune to pain. But pain doesn't listen to preparation. Neither does joy. Neither does life. A Zen teacher once said, enlightenment is intimacy with all things. Not domination, not mastery. Intimacy. The willingness to touch the world without armoring against it. But how do you become intimate with something that won't obey? The truth is, we don't really want life. We want a version of it we can predict. We want wildflowers to bloom on command. We want the river to flow straight. We want no one we love to change or die. We want permanence where there is only impermanence. And yet, beauty lives in the crack. The cracked teacup on the shelf, repaired with gold, holds more than tea. It holds story, fragility, resilience. It reminds us that we were never meant to be unbroken, that control is not what makes something whole. Sometimes, it's the falling apart that reveals the gold. There's an old koan that asks, what do you do when the call you've been waiting for never comes? The mind scrambles for logic, for closure. But the koan isn't asking for a solution. It's asking you to feel the ache of expectation and let it dissolve. Control feels safe because it promises to protect us from that ache. But surrender, real surrender, begins when we're willing to sit with it unshielded. When we stop trying to solve uncertainty and begin to let it breathe beside us. That doesn't mean becoming passive. It means becoming present. There's a difference between control and clarity. Control demands. Clarity perceives. Control resists. Clarity watches. When we let go of control, we don't fall into chaos. We fall into relationship with what is, not what should be. So maybe before the bell is struck, in that sacred silence, we can notice the tightness in our grip, the rigidity in our spine, the belief that if we just hold on a little harder, we won't be surprised, and maybe, just maybe, we can soften. Let the hand tremble, let the breath come in evenly, let the moment remain unresolved, because that's where life waits, not in the safety of certainty, but in the mystery that follows when we stop clinging to the illusion of control. The bell hasn't rung yet, but the sound is already moving through the air. And yet, even knowing this, even catching glimpses of the child's gaze, the golden crack, the truth stitched quietly through paradox, we return to control like a worn coat, frayed at the edges, ill-fitting, but familiar, because control doesn't just promise safety, it promises identity. Who are we after all, without our carefully curated lives? The roles we play, the titles we wear, the plans we believe make us real. Control becomes the scaffolding around the self we think we must maintain. Otherwise, won't everything collapse? But sometimes life pulls a single pin, quietly, effortlessly, and we collapse anyway. I think of a friend who once told me, after losing everything in a sudden divorce, it was like I was floating above my life, watching a version of myself that didn't exist anymore. And at first, I fought. I tried to hold it all up. But eventually, I just let the pieces fall, and in the falling, something else rose. She wasn't talking about enlightenment. She wasn't reaching for meaning. She was describing the raw, bewildering, exquisite moment when identity unravels, and we discover we're still here, still breathing, still listening, still being, even without the scaffolding. There's an old Buddhist story about a monk and a teacup. The student comes to his teacher in distress, listing his problems, his anxieties, his clinging to control. The teacher says nothing. He pours tea into the student's cup until it overflows. The student protests. It's already full. The teacher says, yes, like your mind, until you empty it. Nothing new can enter. But what the story often leaves out is how frightening it is to pour the cup out. We don't know what will fill it again. We don't know who we'll become without the tightness we've mistaken for strength. We don't know what will happen when the bell finally rings. Maybe that's the point. Maybe before the bell, in that suspended, aching stillness, is where we learn to see clearly, where we feel the weight of all we've been holding and begin to ask not whether we can keep holding it, but whether we must. Can we let the water spill? Can we let the crack show? Can we, even for a breath, allow ourselves to not know what comes next? Letting go of control is not a heroic act. It is a gentle, trembling surrender into what already is. It's not a leap into freedom, but a soft exhale into presence. It is the monk's empty cup, the river carving its own path, the child watching the rain without needing it to stop. And in that letting go, not as an act but as a becoming, life begins to whisper again, not in instructions, not in guarantees, but in small, golden surprises we never saw coming because we were too busy trying to predict them. The bell is coming, but not yet. Here, before the sound, before the shift, before the surrender, is a sacred kind of silence. The silence in which we can finally hear the sound of our own grip loosening, and maybe, just maybe, that is where we begin to live. We are taught to move in straight lines. School leads to diploma. Diploma leads to job. Job leads to success. Success, perhaps, to happiness. There's a comfort in the sequence, a promise wrapped in neat progression. If you just keep walking forward, you'll arrive somewhere meaningful. Forward becomes a kind of faith. But life is not a straight line. It never was, even a river, which appears to move steadily from source to sea meanders. It bends around obstacles, doubles back, carves spirals into canyon walls. It doesn't hurry. It doesn't cling to a direction. It responds. Yet somehow, we mistake wandering for failure. We treat detours like disgrace. We live with a secret fear that unless everything unfolds in a logical, upward trajectory, we're falling behind, or worse, falling apart. Where did this idea come from? Perhaps from the myth of maps. Those tidy symbols that reduce terrain to clarity. We love maps because they promise orientation, a fixed point, a plan, a destination. But the map is never the territory, and most of the terrain worth crossing doesn't appear on paper at all. Years ago, I met a man in a train station, middle-aged, quiet, like someone who'd stopped expecting to be noticed. He told me he used to be an architect. Now he carved wooden animals and left them on park benches for children to find. He laughed, a little embarrassed. I used to build towers. Now I leave foxes and frogs in the grass. It doesn't make sense. But his eyes said otherwise. They sparkled with something no skyscraper ever gave him. His life hadn't gone straight. It had unraveled and curled, collapsed and reformed. It had surprised him. And somewhere in the breaking of the line, something softer and stranger had emerged. We rarely choose the spiral. We're taught to mistrust it. But if we look closely, it's everywhere. In the hall of a seashell, in the curl of smoke, in the center of a sunflower. Even the galaxies spin in slow, patient spirals. What if we're not meant to arrive quickly? What if the turning is the point? The Zen tradition doesn't reward progress the way we think. You can sit for 10 years in meditation and feel nothing change. Then one morning, sweeping the temple floor, you hear a bird call, and the self you clung to disappears. Not in triumph, not in achievement, just in silence, in surprise. There's a koan that asks, what is the sound of one hand clapping? It refuses a straight answer. It resists solution. It wants to undo your logic, not satisfy it. The point is not to solve it. The point is to live with it, to let the question untie you from the line you think you're walking. The myth of the straight line tells us that we are the authors of our lives, that control and planning will bring us peace. But planning is not peace. Certainty is not presence, and control is not love. In fact, the most precious things, grief, beauty, connection, awakening, rarely arrive on schedule. I once asked a monk what enlightenment felt like. He smiled. Then he pointed to a puddle reflecting the sky. It looked like a hole in the earth, he said. But when I stepped closer, I saw the clouds. No explanation, no doctrine, just an image, a moment that refused to fit into any line at all. Maybe that's what surrender really is. Not a collapse, but a soft rebellion against the tyranny of the line. A willingness to be rerouted, to be undone, to be held not by certainty, but by wonder. So if you find yourself off course, uncertain, unraveling, consider this: you may not be lost. You may simply be spiraling towards something your straight line could never reach. Let it twist, let it circle, let it not make sense, yet. The map may not match the terrain, but the terrain will still carry you. And maybe, just maybe, the curve in the road is the most honest part of the journey. And yet, even when the line bends, when the map tears, when the compass needle spins in strange directions, part of us still insists this must be wrong. The unexpected detour gets labeled as failure. The long pause becomes a problem to solve. We think, if I can just straighten this again, I'll be back on track. But what if there is no track? Or rather, what if the track is alive, not static? A river doesn't flow in a straight line because life doesn't move like that. The river curves to honor the shape of the land. It bows to tree roots, dances around stones, softens cliffs over centuries. It yields, but never stops. It reaches its destination not by force, but by deep, responsive trust. What if our lives are asking the same of us? I think about the cracked teacup I found in a Kyoto market. Pale porcelain repaired with veins of gold. Kintsugi, the Japanese art of honoring the break. The woman who sold it to me said quietly, "It's more beautiful now." She she didn't smile when she said it. It wasn't a performance. It was truth held like breath. That cup sits on my shelf, not as a metaphor, not as an answer, but as a question I return to again and again. What if the break in the line isn't the end of the story, but the opening? So many of us measure our worth by how uninterrupted our path has been. How linear, how upward, as though being unbroken somehow proves value. But it is precisely the break, the fracture, the twist, that allows light to enter, that invites a new shape. There's a strange courage in not rushing to patch the crack, in sitting with the fracture, letting it speak, letting it breathe, in saying, I don't know where this leads, and I'm going anyway. And here, the paradox enters, because the more we try to force coherence, the tidy arc, the bullet point plan, the success story, the more life resists. But the moment we soften, when we stop demanding the narrative to behave, something truer begins to form. Something curved, something alive. Zen isn't obsessed with clarity. It leans into the absurd, the contradictory, the unresolved. It teaches with stories that loop back on themselves, riddles with no solution, laughter that erupts in silence, not because it wants to confuse you, but because it wants to unseat the part of you that needs everything to make sense. What is your original face? Before your parents were born? Does a dog have Buddha nature? If you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. These aren't instructions, they are koans, wild invitations to fall out of the straight line and into something far less safe, far more sacred. Not knowing is not a flaw in the system, it is the system, and not every step needs to be progress. Some steps are pauses, some are loops, some are collapses that carry within them a quiet seed of transformation. The river always looks chaotic up close, but from the sky, its winding shape reveals the truth. It knows how to get there. So what if your life doesn't look the way you thought it would? What if the plan fell apart because it had to? What if the detour is the teacher? Sometimes we only notice the miracle in hindsight. Sometimes we never notice it at all. We just feel it, like a warm presence brushing past us in the night. A friend once told me, after years of illness and struggle, I would never wish this path on anyone, but I would never give it back. Her voice broke, not from grief, but from awe. Awe at the sheer unlikeliness of what had opened inside her, not because she fought for it, but because, eventually, she stopped. She stopped resisting the curve. She let the river carry her. She let life surprise her. And in that surrender, she didn't lose herself. She met herself for the first time. Not the self she had designed, but the self that had been waiting, just beyond the line. There is a particular sound that only a broken teacup makes. It's not a crash, not always. Sometimes it's just a soft clink, the smallest fracture, like a breath catching in the chest. But once you've heard it, you never forget, because that's the sound of something once whole, becoming something else. We don't like that sound. We don't like what it means. It interrupts our straight lines, our safe stories, our carefully measured futures. And yet, eventually, we all hear it. The job we thought was permanent disappears. The relationship we built our world around dissolves. The body begins to change. The dream, once vibrant, quietly stops making sense. And in that instant, a strange silence, as if the world inhales, as if it's asking, now what will you do with this? There's a kind of panic that sets in when the shape of our life starts to unravel. We scramble to fix it, to glue the pieces back together before anyone notices. We treat impermanence like an error, as if falling apart is a flaw in the system. But what if it isn't? What if it's the most honest part? I remember once watching someone I love pack a suitcase, quietly, no argument, no drama, just the rustle of folded clothes and the slow click of the zipper. That was the moment I realized something I thought I could hold forever was already gone. I sat on the edge of the bed afterward, staring at the teacup on the nightstand. Its handle had been chipped months before. I never noticed how beautiful the crack was until then. The way it caught the light, the way it changed the whole shape of the shadow it cast. Sometimes things fall apart so we can learn to see them again. In Japan, they don't hide broken things. They mend them with gold, kintsugi, golden joinery. Not just a repair, but a reverence. The crack becomes the art. The flaw becomes the feature. The object is not restored to how it was. It is transformed into something it could never have been without the break. What would it be like to see our lives that way? Not as stories broken by failure, but as vessels shaped by time, by grief, by the invisible artistry of becoming. There is something in us, tender, childlike, that believes we can protect what we love by keeping it unchanged. As if love means never letting it bend, or bruise, or break. But anything that can't break also can't deepen, can't open, can't grow roots. Buddhist teachers speak of anicca, impermanence, not as a grim warning, but as a doorway to awakening. Everything we touch is fleeting. Every breath a letting go, every moment a teacher in disguise. When we stop resisting that truth, something astonishing happens. The fear doesn't grow. It softens, it shifts, it begins to glow. We realize we've been trying to control what was never ours to own. And we begin slowly, gently, to open our hands. There is a Zen koan that goes, step by step in the dark. If my foot's not wet, I found the stone. No lantern, no map. Just trust in the body. The moment, the unseen rock below the surface. This is how it feels to move through the breaking, not knowing if we'll land, only that we must keep moving, barefooted and breath held into the unknown. But here's the quiet miracle. The more we let the break be what it is, raw, unfixable, sacred, the more space we find. Space to feel, space to breathe, space to listen to what comes after the falling. Because something always does. Maybe not what we expected, maybe not what we would have chosen, but something that holds the glint of gold in its seams. Something truer than what came before. I once met a woman who had lost her voice. Literally. A sudden illness took her ability to speak. For months she said nothing. She told me much later that in the silence she began to hear things she'd never noticed before. The hum of electricity in the walls, the breath of the cat sleeping beside her, her own heartbeat, and eventually she heard herself, not the voice, but the presence behind the voice, the part of her that had never needed to speak to be whole. She said, I wouldn't undo the breaking. I don't think I ever knew who I was until I stopped trying to sound like someone else. That's the gift no one advertises. When things fall apart, they often leave behind something softer, more honest, something we didn't even know we were missing. The cracked teacup doesn't pour as cleanly. It doesn't stack with the others, but it teaches a different kind of grace. The kind that makes room for what we thought we couldn't survive. We don't have to love the breaking, but we can begin to love who we become in its aftermath. So if your life has cracked, if the handle has snapped off your carefully constructed story, sit for a while, hold it in your hands, look closely at the seams. You may find, even now, the glimmer of gold beginning to appear. And if not yet, then trust the silence. The silence knows what to do. It's already begun. Sometimes the falling apart is slow, imperceptible, like mist seeping through the walls of a house, invisible until the paint begins to peel. Sometimes it happens in an instant. A phone call, a diagnosis, a word said in a certain tone that once heard can't be unheard. The moment you know, viscerally, irreversibly, that something has shifted, that the life you had been holding like a cup of tea has slipped, spilled. We try to catch it, of course, mid-fall. We try to grab what's already broken, as if our grip could restore it. But our hands were never designed to reverse time, only to receive what's real. And sometimes what's real is ruin. But what if ruin isn't the enemy? What if it's the beginning of a new kind of attention? There's something about a cracked teacup that pulls the eye. Not in pity, not in revulsion, but in intimacy. You want to lean in, you want to trace the line, to ask what happened here, who held this before it broke, what stories poured through it before the silence began. We don't do that with perfect things. We admire them from a distance, but broken things, they ask to be known, and maybe that's what surrender is. Not giving up, but giving into the deeper, knowing that control was never the point. That perfection was never the goal. That being real, being fully, vulnerably here, is the more honest, more luminous path. I remember watching my mother hold a plate she'd owned for decades, one of the last from a set passed down by her grandmother. It slipped, it shattered, and for a moment she froze, not in anger, but in reverence. Then she knelt and began to gather the pieces, one by one. Later, I found her gluing them back together, not with the intention of hiding the cracks, but with the desire to preserve what had become. She ran her fingers along the edges softly, as if introducing herself to the plate's new shape. "This," she said, "is not what it was, but maybe it's something else now, something I can love even more." There was no performance in her voice, just presence. The Buddhist teacher Pema Chodron once wrote, "Only to the extent that we expose ourselves over and over to annihilation can that which is indestructible be found in us." It's not a dramatic sentence, though it sounds like one. It's soft, reluctant, tender, the kind of truth you don't rush into. You sit beside it for a while. You let it undo you in gentle waves. Because that indestructible part, it doesn't arrive in armor. It arrives barefoot. It whispers through the cracks. It finds you when you stop pretending. Sometimes it shows up as laughter, not in defiance, but in surrender. That strange, bubbling laugh that rises not from joy, but from being finally, undeniably awake in your grief. Awake in the mess. Awake in the thickness of things, raw, unscripted, real. That's when life starts to speak again, not in the language of plans or timelines or tidy resolutions, but in the language of crows flying overhead, in the way sunlight strikes a kitchen counter, in the silence between two people who don't need to fill it anymore. The teacup doesn't apologize for its crack. It simply waits to be used again, not as it was, but as it is. And we learn slowly to drink from it, gratefully, reverently. The cracked teacup is not a symbol of loss. It is a vessel of transformation, an offering, a reminder that beauty and pain are not opposites. They're partners. They hold hands in the dark. They whisper to each other when we aren't listening. And sometimes, if we listen closely enough, we can hear them singing. A song not of control, but of release. Not of perfection, but of presence. Not of certainty, but of awe. And perhaps that is the only song worth learning. It doesn't announce itself with thunder. It doesn't shout. The moment control slips usually arrives quietly. Like a chair missing one leg, the ground subtly tilts, and suddenly you're not standing where you thought you were. The scenery hasn't changed, but everything feels different. Unnamed. Untethered. Like language has forgotten your name. Sometimes it happens in the middle of a sentence, or halfway through brushing your teeth, or on a Tuesday afternoon when the light outside feels unfamiliar and your thoughts, usually predictable and manageable, begin to spiral like leaves in sudden wind. You reach for your map, the mental one, the one built from past experiences, learned strategies, beliefs you've curated like a museum of certainty. It tells you where to go, what to expect, who you are, what should happen next. But the map doesn't match the territory anymore, and in that instant, there's nothing to grip. Years ago, I lost someone I loved deeply, not to death, but to change. The person stayed alive. The connection didn't. One day we were in sync, our lives braided together, and the next, it unraveled like thread in water. There wasn't even a clear moment, just a slow disintegration. No betrayal, no goodbye, just the quiet vanishing of what had once felt solid. And I did what most of us do when life stops making sense. I tried to fix it. I made lists. I replayed conversations. I charted the arc of our bond, like a scholar analyzing ancient poetry, hoping to discover a hidden code that could explain the disappearance. The effort made me feel productive. It gave me the illusion that maybe, just maybe, I could restore the known world by force of intellect or will. But control, when it slips, doesn't come back just because we beg. Eventually exhausted, I stopped. Not because I wanted to, but because I had nothing left. The analysis didn't help. The map didn't lead anywhere. The compass just spun, and something strange happened in that collapse. A silence opened. Not the silence of defeat, a deeper silence. The kind that doesn't fill the space but reveals it. It wasn't peaceful, not at first. It was raw. I felt like a turtle whose shell had been peeled away. But beneath the rawness, beneath the hum of grief, there was a stillness I had never known. It didn't tell me what would happen next. It didn't promise healing or clarity. But it held me, like a hand I hadn't known I was reaching for. There's a moment in Zen practice called Shoshin, beginner's mind. It isn't naivete. It's the openness that comes when you don't assume you know. When you stop trying to organize reality around your expectations. When you meet the moment with eyes unarmored by certainty. This is what the loss of control can offer if we let it. Not collapse, but return to the breath, to the floor beneath us, to the simple truth that we don't know, that we never really did. And that maybe, just maybe, that's not a problem to solve, but a doorway to pass through. Control is seductive because it feels like protection, but often it's a wall we build between ourselves and the deeper current of life. The river beneath the river, the part of us that already knows how to float, if only we'd stop trying to swim in straight lines. There's a koan I return to often. Without speaking, without silence, how can you express the truth? It always disorients me, and that's the point. The mind wants direction. The heart wants experience. The spirit wants surrender. The koan gives you none of these, only a space in which your clinging becomes visible. And once you see your grip, you can begin to loosen it. I think about the child's gaze, how it lands on things without needing to name them. The way a child can stare at dust motes in sunlight, as if watching the birth of stars. They don't need context. They don't need the story to make sense. They just are in the moment, because they haven't yet learned to resist it. We forget that kind of wonder. We trade it for plans, but the truth is, wonder often returns the moment the map fails us. When our rehearsed answers fall apart, we begin to ask better questions. Who am I? When I'm no longer holding the pieces together? What remains when what I love is no longer mine to keep? What lives in the silence that follows the unraveling? These are not comfortable questions, but they are sacred ones. And sometimes when you stop running from them, when you sit and let them echo without interference, you realize you're not falling, you're arriving, not into something new, but into something more real. Maybe that's what stillness truly is. Not an absence of movement, but the quiet presence that holds everything once you've let go of needing to control it. The map is gone, but your feet are still on the ground. The story you were telling has dissolved, but the breath continues, and somewhere deep in the ribs, something ancient exhales and says, "Ah, finally, now we can begin." Sometimes the slip comes not as a collapse, but as a subtle reorientation, like a painting hung just slightly crooked. You try to ignore it, tell yourself it's fine, but something feels off. Familiar streets seem too wide. Conversations land a half-inch to the left. Your thoughts echo louder than usual. And your hands, your dependable, competent hands, hesitate before reaching for the things they've touched 1,000 times before. This is not panic. Not yet. This is the early disorientation, quiet disturbance beneath the surface. A friend once described it to me like this. It was as if my life had been written in ink, and one day it began to blur. Her job was the same, her partner still kind, her routines intact, but she could feel something loosening behind her ribs, a subtle unraveling of certainty. She said it wasn't sadness or even fear, it was something stranger, something like gravity shifting direction. I kept trying to write my way forward, she said, but none of the words held. So she stopped writing, not forever, just for long enough to stop pretending she knew what came next. There's a peculiar freedom that arises when control slips. At first, it terrifies, because so much of our identity is built around what we can hold together, roles, habits, names. But when we're forced to let go, when we've exhausted the scaffolding and the maps begin to fade, we find ourselves in a space we rarely visit nowhere. Not the past, not the future, not the well-constructed self we've spent years refining. Just here, just now, just this as it is. In Buddhist temples, there are gardens of raked gravel and scattered stones. They're not symmetrical. There's no focal point. You can't solve them with the eye. The purpose is to invite stillness through disorientation, to let your sense of order fall apart long enough that something deeper than understanding might arise. One morning, after a long stretch of personal unraveling, I found myself sitting on a bench in such a garden. I didn't go seeking wisdom. I didn't even go for peace. I just didn't know where else to be. My plans had dissolved. My ambitions had become strangers. Even my prayers felt too scripted. So I sat, and something began to shift. Not dramatically, not like lightning, more like the quiet click of an old lock turning. I realized I didn't have to know. Not now. Maybe not ever. I didn't have to name what was happening or fix it or even understand it. I could just stay. Not cling, not run. Just breathe and allow the moment, strange, unmapped, and unscripted, to be enough. And that was the beginning of stillness. Not the kind you meditate into. The kind that finds you when you stop insisting on direction. Zen often asks, what is this? Not as a demand, but as an invitation. Not to define, but to witness. What is this breath? What is this silence? What is this moment when the path dissolves and all that remains is the weight of your body on the earth? In that nowhere space, the space where control has slipped and certainty has collapsed, we are closest to what's real. The mask thins, the performance pauses, and what remains is not an answer, but a kind of presence we can't manufacture. It doesn't make promises. It doesn't guarantee ease, but it is real. It meets you exactly where you are, without requirement. And sometimes, in the middle of that disorientation, something unexpected begins to emerge. Not a solution, not a new plan, just a softness, a receptivity, a kind of listening you didn't know your body was capable of. It's in this space, this still, strange place where control has slipped, that we begin to learn another way of moving, not by grasping, but by attending, not by pushing forward, but by yielding, by feeling, by responding, like a leaf floating on a stream, not because it has no will, but because it trusts the current more than its fear of being lost. This is where the river first makes itself known. The river beneath the river, the deeper flow we can't name, but which has carried us all along, even when we thought it was us doing the carrying. And maybe that's the real grace of disorientation. It shows us that surrender is not an end. It is the beginning of a different kind of knowing. The kind that waits, the kind that listens, the kind that finally lets life speak. There's a question in Zen that doesn't ask to be answered, only lived with. What is your original face before your parents were born? It lands like a feather on the surface of the mind, light, almost silly. But try to hold it and it sinks straight through. The question doesn't mean to confuse you, or maybe it does, but only to loosen something deeper than logic. Because when you hear it, truly hear it, the mind begins to tremble. You start to notice all the faces you've worn, the roles, the names, the identities you inherited and performed, all in the hope that they'd tether you to something solid. But beneath the performance, who, before the stories, what? Before memory, before form, before self, what is there? The question is absurd on purpose. It unhooks the mind from linear time. It forces you to step outside the sequence you've been taught to trust. This happened, then this, then I became who I am. But if the foundation of you lies before all of that, who's been watching? I remember the first time I heard that koan. I was sitting in a room with a teacher who had the kind of presence that made time feel like warm wax. Everything slowed. He said the words slowly, like laying stones in a river. What is your original face before your parents were born? The room didn't react. No one moved. I stared at the wall. Something inside me wanted to protest. It made no sense. It wasn't answerable, but something deeper, just below thought, stirred. Not a picture, just space. That night I couldn't sleep, not because I was thinking, but because something in me had gone quiet. Not peaceful, but empty. Like all the definitions I'd clung to had been lifted just far enough away that I could see them for what they were: masks. Useful, yes. Beautiful even. But not me. It's a strange thing to realize you don't know who you are in the way you thought you did. Not in a dramatic, existential crisis way, but in a soft, disorienting stillness that says, maybe the self I've been protecting isn't the self I've actually been. And maybe that's a good thing. There's a kind of trust that grows in the absence of answers. A trust not in beliefs, but in being. The way a child trusts their reflection in a puddle. They don't ask whether it's accurate. They don't worry about the angle. They just see it, giggle, splash, and move on. The child's gaze doesn't need narrative. It only needs presence. Zen doesn't hand you identity. It hands you questions shaped like riddles. And sometimes those riddles become mirrors. Not the kind that show you your face, but the kind that show you where the face ends. We spend so much of our lives constructing a self, refining it, defending it, marketing it. And then a single question, absurd, ancient, featherlight, slips through the cracks and dissolves the structure from within. What's left is not emptiness in the hollow sense. It's spaciousness, like standing in a wide field at dawn before the world begins to name itself. There's an old Zen drawing, a circle open at the edge. It's not an image of perfection. It's not even a destination. It's the moment just before completion, the recognition that wholeness doesn't close in on itself. It breathes, it receives. It doesn't need to be defined. Maybe your original face isn't something you can remember. Maybe it's something you return to the moment you stop trying to remember anything at all. The moment you stop rehearsing who you've been. The moment you stop tightening around a name, a job, a story. And in that release, that quiet loosening, you find something beneath everything else. A stillness, a witness, a smile that has no owner. And suddenly you're not reaching for control anymore, you're simply here, breathing, uncovered, unfinished, real. The mind tries to circle back, to solve the riddle, to trace it logically, to pin it to a memory or a metaphor. What is your face before your parents were born? The question doesn't ask for interpretation. It asks for unmaking. It asks you to sit in the fire of not knowing until your insistence on explanation burns away. Because somewhere in the space beyond explanation, beyond understanding, lies something quieter and more intimate than answers presence. Have you ever seen the face of a newborn? Just moments after birth, not the smiles people project or the photo moments staged for families, but the unmasked, unfiltered gaze of someone who has just arrived in the world. The face is not yet a person. It's something older, timeless, not performing, not hiding, just here. That may be the closest thing we have to what the koan points toward. Not a face with features, but a kind of being, pre-language, pre-identity, pre-story. And the paradox is, this original face isn't something we lose over time. It's something we layer over. We don't grow away from it. We build costumes on top of it until one day, the costumes feel more familiar than the skin beneath. Zen doesn't tear those layers off in dramatic fashion. It invites them to fall on their own gently, through sustained inquiry, through presence, through not flinching in the face of paradox. There's a story of a Zen student who asked his master how to find the true self. The master handed him a broom. "Sweep the garden," he said. The student swept for hours. Nothing happened. Frustrated, he said, "Master, I've been sweeping and sweeping, but I still don't understand." The teacher took the broom, tapped it on the ground, and said, "There. Now you've heard it. No elaboration. Just the sound. Just the moment. No story to frame it, no lesson to extract. Just the absurd, immediate truth of a broom tapping earth." We think awakening will feel like fireworks. Sometimes it feels like silence, like sweeping, like the moment you finally stop trying to figure it out. There's a softness that comes when we stop demanding identity to hold still. When we let our face be not a thing, but a doorway. A shifting mirror that doesn't need to be explained to be real. When we allow our sense of self to become fluid again, like a river running backward through time, dissolving the illusions it once carried, not disappearing, just loosening, just letting go of the story long enough to remember the breath beneath it. Because in the end, the koan isn't asking for your face. It's asking you to see without needing to be seen, to listen without positioning yourself as the listener, to dissolve just long enough to feel the pulse of life moving through you, before any name, before any grip, before the maps, before the masks. And in that moment, brief as a flash of light on still water, you glimpse something unrepeatable, the original face, not as an answer, but as an encounter, and it disappears just as quickly, because it was never something to hold, only something to recognize and return to again and again. We confuse surrender with defeat, as if letting go means falling down, failing, disappearing, as if loosening our grip means we've lost the thread, when in truth, it might be the first time we're finally holding life with open hands. There's an old parable about a river, told in different ways across cultures, but always pointing to the same current. It goes something like this: a traveler comes upon a wide, rushing river. There is no bridge, no boat, only the current, strong and untamed. On the far side, they see the continuation of their path, the next chapter of a life waiting. So they gather wood and vines, building a raft to carry them across. It takes time, it takes effort, but finally they cross. And then, standing on the other shore, they're faced with a choice. Do they carry the raft with them on their back, or do they leave it behind? Most of us carry the raft. Even when we've reached new ground, we still clutch the old tools of survival. We drag them forward. The plans, the anxieties, the tight systems of control we once needed. We convince ourselves we still need them, just in case. But the raft is only useful for crossing. Beyond that, it becomes a burden. Surrender is not collapse. It's the moment we stop carrying what no longer serves the path we're walking. Everything in us resists that moment. Because those tools, those plans, those old patterns of gripping, they got us through. They made us feel safe when the world didn't. They shaped the version of ourselves we learned to trust. Letting them go can feel like death. But sometimes what we call death is only space being made for something unimagined. I once sat by a river in early autumn, watching a single leaf spin in a whirlpool near the bank. It wasn't stuck. It wasn't drowning. It was circling, held in a rhythm not of its choosing, but not hostile either. Every few seconds, It drifted closer to the current's center, then spun out again like a breath. Inhale, exhale, release. It looked peaceful, but I remember thinking, that leaf isn't trying to escape, it's listening. Most of us live in resistance to flow. We try to carve shortcuts. We dam up emotions, fearing their power. We insist on forward motion, even when life is asking us to pause, to be still, to unmake. We don't trust the water. We mistake its movement for threat. But what if surrender isn't about giving up, but giving to? Giving to the mystery, giving to the moment, giving to the truth that life, like the river, knows more than our maps can show. There's a saying in Taoism, the softest thing in the world overcomes the hardest. Water carves stone not with aggression, but with patience. It flows around resistance. It adapts, it absorbs, it waits. It does not collapse, it endures by yielding. When you meet a river honestly, not from the shore, but from within, you realize it's not trying to take you. It's trying to hold you. It wants you to stop paddling upstream, to stop performing exhaustion, to stop thinking that control is the same as direction. There's a still point in the center of surrender, and it is not passive. It's awake. It's precise. It's the moment you stop trying to solve your life and start letting it reveal itself. I met a woman once who had lost everything in a fire: home, work, photographs, history, gone in an afternoon. When I asked her what the hardest part was, she didn't say the loss. She said it was the moment she realized no one could rebuild it for her. She would have to decide what mattered now, not what had mattered then. She paused and said, it was terrifying and also holy, like being born again, but this time with my eyes open. That's what surrender can feel like. Not a fall, but a float. Not the end of control, but the beginning of communion. Not a collapse, but a conscious releasing, like a leaf, letting go of its branch, not because it's weak, but because it trusts the ground to receive it. Zen doesn't ask you to drown. It asks you to soften, to notice the effort, to loosen slowly, to trust that the river has space for you, even when you no longer know who you are without your raft. Because that's where the surprise begins. Not in triumph, but in tenderness. Not in conquest, but in communion. And once the letting go has begun, once you've felt the quiet dignity of flowing with, not against, you'll wonder how you ever mistook surrender for defeat. The river was never your enemy. It was your teacher all along. If you've ever stood waist deep in a river, you know this: the current is not neutral. It presses. Not violently, not always, but with intent. You feel its invitation in the pull behind your knees, in the way it tugs at your balance. Your first instinct is to resist. Plant your feet, brace. As if rooted stillness means strength. But after a while, the muscles tire. Holding yourself against what wants to carry you begins to feel like a misunderstanding. You start to wonder, not loudly, but somewhere deep in the ribs. What if I just let go a little, not leap, not drown, just loosen, just feel the water, just see where it might take you? This is where the confusion begins, because we're taught that letting go means losing ourselves, that if we stop managing, controlling, directing, we'll dissolve into chaos, we'll disappear. But the river doesn't want to erase you, it wants to show you something. A version of movement that doesn't begin in fear, a version of power that doesn't require tension, a version of self that doesn't grip so tightly it forgets how to feel. A friend of mine, a dancer in her 70s, once said to me, I didn't know how stiff I was until I tried to fall on purpose. She was describing a movement exercise meant to teach trust, leaning backward until gravity takes over. At first, she resisted. Her body did what it always did: protect, control, correct. But the moment she gave in, just enough, she said, it was like being caught by something ancient and kind. Not collapse, not passivity, something else. This is what surrender asks of us. Not to stop caring, but to stop clutching. not to disappear, but to dissolve the need to be in charge of what can't be directed, to feel the ground disappear beneath you and remember that falling and flying sometimes start from the same motion. We all carry secret rivers inside us, unspoken griefs, currents of longing, dreams we abandoned because they didn't fit the plan, questions we've silenced because the answers scared us. Surrender is what happens when those rivers are no longer dammed by fear or expectation. It's what happens when we finally say, I don't know where this leads, and I'm willing to find out. And in that willingness, quiet, trembling, alive, something in the world begins to respond. Not dramatically, no lightning, no epiphany, just small shifts, a bird calling at the right moment, a stranger's kindness, a sense, however brief, that you're not drifting, but arriving. Zen teaches us to sit still in the storm, not to control the sky, but to become so present that even the thunder is a form of silence. The paradox is that in letting go, we become more rooted, not in outcomes, but in presence, like the river stone polished smooth by surrender, or the reed that bends and does not break. This isn't the kind of power that looks impressive from the outside. It won't win arguments, it won't trend, but it will bring you home, to the deeper rhythm beneath your striving, the part of you that already knows how to float. Letting go doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you stop pretending you're in charge of the current. It means you trust that what carries you knows how to arrive, even if you don't. There's a moment in the flow where effort disappears, not because you gave up, but because you remembered you were never supposed to paddle this hard in the first place. And in that moment, the river feels less like something outside of you and more like something you've always been made of. Moving, alive, home. It didn't happen all at once. There was no dramatic letting go, no epiphany wrapped in thunder. Just a morning like any other, where the light came in slightly sideways and the air held a hush that felt unfamiliar. Not empty, but emptied, like something had quietly stepped out of the room. I didn't know it at the time, but that was the day I stopped trying to fix everything. For years, maybe all my adult life, I had lived like a repair person for the emotional plumbing of the world. Tight connection, I'll loosen it. Strange silence, I'll fill it. A crack in the rhythm, I'll smooth it over, even if it's not mine. Somewhere inside me was this unspoken belief. If I could just manage things well enough, relationships, feelings, conversations, expectations, no one would fall apart, especially me. It wasn't control in the aggressive sense. It was more subtle, more tired. The kind of control that smiles while holding its breath, that listens not to understand but to anticipate, that loves, yes, but through a kind of constant editing, like running your hands over a surface again and again to check for splinters. And then one day, I just couldn't do it anymore. Not out of despair, not even frustration, just weariness. I remember standing in the kitchen, a mess around me. Dishes undone, unanswered emails. A conversation from the night before still hanging in the air like steam from a kettle. Normally I would have gone into motion. Teddy solve, repair. But that morning I didn't. I sat down. I looked out the window at the bare trees, and I thought, without resistance, what if nothing needs to be fixed right now? It wasn't a soothing thought. Not immediately, it felt strange, unguarded, like standing without armor, but underneath the strangeness something softer stirred. Not peace, not yet, but curiosity, reluctant, raw curiosity. What if I don't know what this moment needs? What if it doesn't need anything at all? It's a question that Zen asks in 1,000 indirect ways, not because it wants to strip you of care or action, but because it wants to uncoil the reflex that says, I must fix this to be okay. The cracked teacup doesn't apologize for breaking. It doesn't try to glue itself back together. It simply is what it is, and it remains useful, beautiful even, especially when someone is willing to hold it without judgment, without shame, without the constant compulsion to mend. That day in the kitchen, I didn't meditate. I didn't light candles or recite mantras. I didn't do anything spiritual. I just allowed the moment to be unresolved. I let the tension remain suspended, like a question unanswered, a string untuned. And the world didn't end. The people I loved didn't vanish. My identity didn't collapse. Something did shift though, quietly like weather. A loosening, a softening, a release of the breath I didn't know I'd been holding since childhood. Since the day I first learned that being helpful could keep me safe. Since the first time I believed that love meant solving someone else's storm before they knew it was raining. Since the moment I mistook control for care. What replaced the fixing instinct wasn't passivity. It was presence, and with presence came space, not just for others, but for me. The version of myself who didn't have to be useful to be allowed to exist. That's what reluctant curiosity does. It peels back the armor slowly. It doesn't demand surrender, it invites it. It says you don't have to solve the river, just notice its flow. Just stand beside it for a while and see what it tells you. Sometimes it tells you everything's okay, even if it's unfinished. Even if you don't understand it yet. Even if nothing is resolved, there's a kind of wisdom in not rushing the restoration, in letting the fracture breathe before you patch it, in asking what wants to be known here, not fixed, but felt. It's not easy. It requires patience. It requires the willingness to feel things you'd rather outrun. But slowly, through that patience, something deeper emerges. The mess becomes less threatening. The silence becomes less sharp. The ache becomes less lonely. And in their place, the smallest miracle, your own presence, returned to you. Not as a solution, not as a product, but as an offering, a being, a breath. A kind of unguarded okayness with not knowing what comes next. That day I stopped fixing everything didn't change my life. It simply revealed it. Later that same day, I remember walking through the park with no particular destination. Normally I would have had a reason, an errand, a phone call, a podcast filling the space. But I left my headphones in my pocket and just walked. It was an early spring afternoon, the kind where winter still lingers in the shadows, but the light has begun to remember warmth. I noticed small things I would have missed if I'd been in fixing mode. A child chasing a leaf across the path. A dog lying on its side in a patch of sun, like it had nowhere more important to be. A bench carved with the name of someone who had once loved this place enough to be remembered here. I didn't analyze any of it. I didn't write a story in my head about what it all meant. I just noticed, and the noticing felt, for the first time in a long time, like enough. That's the quiet magic of reluctant curiosity. It asks nothing heroic of you. It doesn't demand transformation. It just invites you to be available to what is already happening without needing to fix it, name it, or mold it into a shape you understand. It's like looking at the cracked teacup, not as a problem to hide, but as an invitation to appreciate what has survived. You stop asking, how do I make this whole again? And start asking, what has this become now that it's no longer what it was? That question, I've learned, is a doorway. I think of my friend Lara, who used to rush to fill every silence in conversation. She was brilliant, quick, generous, the kind of person who could anticipate your needs before you voiced them. But during a difficult year, when grief stripped her of answers, she began to practice not speaking. Not because she had nothing to say, but because she was learning to respect the unknown, to let silences stay silent long enough to reveal something unexpected. She told me once, I used to think silence meant failure. Now I wonder if it's the most honest language we have. That landed in me like a stone dropped in still water. The habit of fixing is often a response to fear. The fear of stillness, of discomfort, of watching someone we love hurt. But love doesn't always need to be efficient, and it certainly doesn't need to be solved. Sometimes it just needs room. Sometimes it asks you to sit beside someone, or yourself, in the dark without fumbling for the light switch. And this too is surrender, not the dramatic kind, the quieter kind, the kind that doesn't wave a flag or name itself brave, the kind that whispers, "I don't need to be the answer," that leans back from the reflex and says, "Maybe this is enough, just as it is." There's a deeper kind of strength in not rushing to restore order, in letting the river run muddy for a while, in trusting that clarity returns in its own time, not when summoned, but when invited. What I've learned since that day, that strangely soft, strangely ordinary day, I stopped trying to fix everything, is that life doesn't collapse when you step out of its way. It breathes. It doesn't demand your management. It welcomes your presence. And when you stop reaching to control the moment begins to reveal itself to you in ways it never could before. Like a stranger who finally speaks once you've stopped talking. Curiosity doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you start wondering, gently, without agenda, what this life might become if you stopped insisting it look a certain way. That's not the end of control. That's the beginning of communion. There is a way of seeing that doesn't try to own what it sees. A gaze not shaped by judgment, nor driven by need, but offered freely, like light on water, unrehearsed, undemanding, present. This is the gaze of the child before language, before strategy, before the craving to make meaning out of everything we touch. And once in a while, if we're lucky, or maybe just willing, we remember how to look that way again. I saw it once in a boy crouched beside a storm drain, utterly entranced by a beetle crawling across the edge of the sidewalk. The cars rushed by. The world moved fast around him, but his gaze didn't flicker. He wasn't trying to understand the beetle. He wasn't narrating its story, or calculating its size, or wondering what it meant. He was simply with it. No agenda, no grasping. He wasn't looking for something. He was looking with something. And in that moment, he was more awake than any adult I passed that day. We're taught to see in order to know, but children, before we train that out of them, see in order to feel. Their gaze is not acquisitive, it's reverent. They aren't trying to solve the river. They're playing in the current. Somewhere along the path of growing up, we start trading this gaze for a more armored one. We look through lenses shaped by purpose and fear, measuring, comparing, categorizing. We start assuming that to see something clearly, we must first define it, and to define it, we must pin it down, freeze it, reduce it to something manageable. But true seeing is never about control, it's about presence. It's about being so still that the world begins to reveal itself. Not the version we expect, but the one that has always been here, quietly waiting beneath the noise of our intentions. Zen teachers often speak of no mind, not as blankness, but as a kind of vivid emptiness, a mind that doesn't cling, a seeing that doesn't possess. In that state, perception becomes encounter. Everything you meet is alive again. The cup in your hand, the breath in your lungs, the silence between sounds. And yet, arriving at that state isn't something you can force. You can't muscle your way into wonder. You have to soften. You have to unlearn. I once spent an afternoon with my niece, who at the time was 3 and entirely uninterested in linear time. We were walking through a park on the way to get lunch, and she kept stopping. To poke a stick into the dirt, to watch a squirrel twitch its tail, to stare at a flower like it held the secret of the universe in its trembling petals. At first, I felt the impatience rise. The adult part of me wanted to move along, to get somewhere, to complete the plan. But something in her presence held me. She wasn't being difficult. She was being alive. And the more I watched her, the more I felt something in myself soften. Time, for a moment, lost its shape. We never made it to lunch. But I remember that flower. I remember the way the sun bent around its edge, the way its color changed the longer I looked. I had passed flowers like that 1,000 times before, but I had never truly seen one until I let go of the urge to move past it. The child's gaze is not a tool, it's a posture. One of wonder, one of willingness, one of release. And it's always available to us, not through effort, but through surrender. When we stop trying to use our eyes to command the world, we begin to receive it. The world, it turns out, was never hiding. We were just too busy demanding it reveal itself on our terms. To see without grasping is to remember that everything you love is changing. That beauty lives in the unheld. That all requires spaciousness, not certainty. It is to look at the cracked teacup and feel gratitude, not loss. To watch the river flow and not demand it slow down for your understanding. To see your own reflection, aging, softening, shifting, and greet it like a familiar stranger returning home. The child does not name impermanence, but they live in it naturally. They don't grieve the leaf falling from the tree. They chase it. They don't mourn the puddle disappearing in the sun. They splash in it while it lasts. They don't hoard the moment, they inhabit it. What we call surrender, they call play. What we call presence, they call life. And maybe, just maybe, seeing as they do is not a regression, but a return. A return to the kind of gaze that doesn't ask, what does this mean for me? But simply asks, what is this right now? And maybe that's enough. I once asked a Zen teacher what it meant to truly see. He didn't answer with philosophy. He reached for a plum from the table beside him, held it up to the light, and said, "Look at this as if you've never seen a plum before." Then he bit into it, slowly, juice running down his chin, eyes closed. Not in performance, but in reverence. When he opened them again, he smiled and said, "That's all, that's all." Not an answer, not a truth to memorize, just a shift in how attention is given. A gaze unarmored by expectation, an intimacy with the ordinary so deep it becomes extraordinary again. This is what the child remembers, what we forget in our rush to predict, control, and manage what we see. To the child, the world is not a solved equation. It is a conversation, a flickering miracle that keeps changing the moment you try to hold it still. They are not collecting data. They are being changed by contact. And that's what surrender really is. Not the loss of self, but the loosening of the self that tries to always define. The self that must always label, interpret, acquire. The self that believes knowing is safer than not knowing. That having a handle on a thing is more valuable than letting it touch you. When a child sees a snail cross a sidewalk, they don't rush it, they crouch low, they watch with stillness. They might whisper something only the snail can hear. Not because they're trying to understand nature, but because, for that moment, they are nature. There's no barrier, that's the gaze we lose. And that's the gaze we can relearn, if we stop gripping reality and instead begin to greet it. Not every adult forgets, though. I met an elderly woman once who carried a small magnifying glass in her coat pocket, not for reading, for noticing. She would pause mid-walk, mid-sentence, mid-thought, hold up the lens to a leaf, a piece of bark, the edge of a feather, and just look. I like to be surprised, she told me once without irony. To look without grasping is not to be passive. It's to be porous. It's to make yourself available to beauty on its own terms, not yours. To stand before a teacup with a gold-seamed crack and not think imperfect, but rather alive. To feel wonder not because something is flawless, but because it's real. Whole not in spite of its break, but because of it. Children don't resist impermanence because they live so close to it. Their teeth fall out. Their clothes no longer fit. Their questions change overnight. And because they're still new to time, they don't pretend permanence is a promise. They grieve in one breath and laugh in the next. They cry when something is beautiful. They ask why the moon is following the car. And they don't wait for an answer they can use. They're already satisfied in the wonder. Somewhere, long before language, we knew this too. We knew how to let life in without fencing it. We knew how to see without capturing. And then, slowly, we traded that gaze for something more useful, more strategic, more adult. But the eyes remember, and when we soften, even just for a moment, they begin to remember how to see again. We stop bracing for meaning and start opening to mystery. We stop grasping at form and begin touching the formless. We stop needing every moment to be useful and let it be what it is: brief, brilliant, unrepeatable. Like a plum in the hand of a teacher. Like a beetle crossing the sidewalk under a child's watchful eyes. Like this breath, right now, seen not through the lens of what does this mean, but through the quiet knowing of this is. There's a kind of silence that only arrives in autumn. Not the silence of absence, but of attention. The kind that wraps itself around a single falling leaf and waits. Not to interpret, not to judge, but simply to be there as it falls. I once watched a leaf drift for what felt like an eternity. Caught in no hurry, it spun gently in midair, shifting between glints of gold and shadow. It didn't fall in a line. It danced, it changed direction. It paused on the breeze like a breath being held. And then, eventually, it touched the earth and was still. There was no announcement, no conclusion, only the quiet truth of its movement from branch to ground. And in that space, a question began to form in me, not with words, but with sensation. What if this is how we are meant to live? Not clinging, not predicting, just dancing with gravity. There's a Zen koan that goes like this. The wind blows and the leaves fall. Is it the wind that moves, or the leaf? The mind reaches for an answer, the intellect flexes. But the point is not to resolve the question. The point is to stand in the wind, to feel the leaf fall, and notice the place in you that wants to name it, and then let that go too. Because surrender doesn't begin in clarity. It begins in softening toward the mystery, in letting the leaf fall without deciding why, in allowing movement to mean what it means, even if we never understand it. This is what the falling leaf teaches, not through instruction, but through example. It lets go not because it has figured everything out, but because it's time. The branch no longer holds, the wind calls, and so it yields. There is no resistance in the leaf, no second guessing, no performance of grace. Its surrender is complete, and in that surrender, it becomes art. Not for anyone watching, not for legacy, but because in that one final arc through the air, it is utterly itself. When we soften, truly soften, we touch that same freedom. We begin to live less like plans and more like poetry, not fixed, but fluid, not defined, but unfolding. I think of a friend who once told me, after the end of a long relationship, that she kept trying to figure out what it all meant. She read old letters, dissected conversations, replayed scenes in her mind. She wanted closure. She wanted answers. But one afternoon, while walking beneath a row of trees shedding their last leaves, something inside her loosened. I realized I didn't need to know anymore, she said. I just needed to feel the loss without trying to fix it. That, too, was a kind of falling, a descent into truth, not with explanation, but with acceptance. The paradox is this: when we stop reaching for meaning, meaning begins to find us. Quietly, unassumingly, like a leaf landing in our open hand. Koans are meant to disrupt the mind's desire for straight lines. They are not riddles, they are invitations. Their power lies not in what they explain, but in what they dissolve. Like the falling leaf, they don't arrive to be solved. They arrive to be witnessed. They ask us to be still long enough to let the question ask us something back. Can you rest in motion? Can you trust the fall? Can you be shaped by something you cannot control? These aren't just philosophical games. They are gestures of the heart, asking us to live with more attention and less armor, more presence, less prediction. And in that softening, that giving way of will into wonder, we may find that we don't need to hold everything together after all. We just need to be willing to fall gently into the next breath. The leaf doesn't know where it will land, but it lands, and perhaps in its landing, it teaches us something we forgot, that letting go is not the end. It is the beginning of touching the world without needing to possess it. But what does it mean, really, to live like the falling leaf, when so much in us wants to stay on the branch? We are conditioned to believe that stability is virtue, that those who hold on the longest win, that to loosen your grip is to lose your place, your meaning, your identity. Yet the leaf doesn't ask, what will happen to me? It simply lets the moment shape it. It lets gravity and wind write its final stanza. And what if that is not collapse but clarity? Years ago, I sat with a monk in a Kyoto garden, watching the maple leaves descend around us like embers. He turned to me, smiling, and said, "They fall because they've fulfilled their purpose, but they are still beautiful on the ground." Then he asked, "Can you be beautiful when you are not holding anything together?" His words landed like a stone in a still pond. The question echoed long after I returned home, especially in moments when life no longer followed the script I'd written for it. When a job slipped through my hands, when a friendship unraveled without warning, when I woke one morning and realized I no longer wanted the life I'd so carefully built. I clung to plans, explanations, timelines. I wanted the branch. But the branch had already let go of me. There is a strange tenderness in realizing that nothing is truly solid, that what we call security is often a choreography of effort, not essence. And in that realization, something begins to soften, not out of defeat, but out of recognition, out of truth. We begin to sense that life is not asking us to control it. It is asking us to participate in its unfolding, to feel what is rising, not strategize it, to be moved, not just to move. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, our gaze shifts from the horizon to the air around us, to the texture of the moment itself, the golden hush of dusk, the smell of rain before it arrives, the quiet ache in the chest that says, "Let go now." We don't have to call this spiritual. We can just call it alive. Alive in a way that isn't concerned with narrative arcs or tidy endings. Alive like a leaf that knows only this: the fall is not failure. It is flight of another kind. And perhaps, if we allow it, we can be like the leaf. Not passive, not resigned, but responsive, aware, light, composed not of certainty, but of surrender. We are not here to clutch at permanence. We are here to feel the beauty of each release. There's a kind of silence that arrives not when the world goes quiet, but when the story you are telling yourself no longer holds. You reach for a narrative, a frame, a thread to follow, but your hand comes back empty. This is not the silence of peace, it's the silence of disorientation. And yet, in that hollow space where logic used to live, something luminous begins to stir. Most of us don't know how to live without a story. We string moments into arcs, as if life were a novel unfolding chapter by chapter. Cause and effect, struggle and triumph, a reason for everything. It comforts us, this architecture. But chaos, real chaos, the kind that guts the foundation and erases the outlines, refuses to be cast in narrative. It just is. It doesn't care what act of the play you think you're in. And still, it gives us something. Years ago, I missed a flight that I had no room to miss. It was one of those days where everything unraveled. Missed connections, weather delays, a dead phone battery, the last train pulling away just as I arrived. I remember standing on the platform with my bag at my feet and this furious heat rising in my chest. I had done everything right. I had planned and checked and rechecked, but none of it mattered. My carefully held itinerary collapsed in front of me. There was no heroic pivot, no miraculous stroke of luck, just a cracked hour in a foreign city I hadn't meant to see. But somewhere between the frustration and the silence that followed, I looked up. The rain had just stopped, and the sky was a kind of blue that doesn't translate. A street vendor nearby was laughing with a child, steam curling up from a pan of something fragrant. I remember thinking, I'm not where I was supposed to be, and yet I'm here. That realization was not dramatic, it was simple, almost quiet, but it felt like something deep had clicked free. We wait for clarity to arrive in thunderclaps, but sometimes it comes like this: a moment outside the script, an uninvited stillness, a glitch in the plot line that turns into a glimpse. Buddhism doesn't ask you to make sense of it. It doesn't offer comforting resolutions or quick truths. It hands you a cracked teacup and says, look again. It asks you to stand in the middle of the storm without reaching for a moral, without calling it bad or good, just to witness it, not from the place of commentary, but from the place before thought. Can you be surprised without explanation? Can you hold awe without needing to earn it? There's a Zen story about a monk who, while being chased by a tiger, falls off a cliff, grasping a vine. Suspended between the predator above and certain death below, he notices a single strawberry growing from the cliffside. With no escape possible, he reaches out, plucks the strawberry, and eats it. The story ends there. No redemption, no rescue. Just how sweet it tasted. It's so easy to read that parable and rush toward metaphor, to make it about mindfulness or presence or gratitude. But the deeper invitation is not interpretation, it's participation. Could you, in that absurd, suspended moment, simply taste? Surprise is what rushes in when control steps out. Not because the surprise was waiting all along, but because our obsession with direction had clouded our ability to notice, to be startled by now, by this very breath, by the way the sunlight stains the floor, by the tiny pang of emotion you didn't expect. Surprise without story is raw, inconvenient, disorienting, and sacred. We often think of wisdom as something that accumulates, something we gather like stones. But what if it's the opposite? What if wisdom is what's left when all your stories drop away and something quiet and utterly unearned looks back at you? What if life is not leading you somewhere, but always inviting you deeper here? Letting go is not passive, it's not resignation. It's radical attention without demand. It's stepping into the current without needing to know where it ends. And when you do, when even for a flicker of a second you release the thread, life doesn't fall apart. It reveals itself. A child doesn't need a reason to laugh. A river doesn't need a name to move. And the most honest moments in your life, the ones that truly changed you, probably didn't arrive wrapped in certainty. They arrived wild and wordless and whole. But what if the story was never the point? What if surprise, pure, unstoried surprise, is the moment the world touches you directly without needing to explain itself? What if chaos isn't failure or punishment or bad karma, but simply life's way of saying, this too is part of the whole? There is a strange generosity in the moments that break us open, not because they feel good, they often don't, but because they ask nothing of us but our presence. When your plans dissolve, when your maps blur, when your name doesn't quite fit anymore, that's when something else begins. Not new exactly, but newly seen. The sacred isn't always soft. Sometimes it arrives as a crack in the glass, a flat tire, a diagnosis, a confession. Sometimes the holy knocks over the teacup just to show you the shape of the spill. There's a Japanese practice called kintsugi, the art of repairing broken pottery with gold. The cracks are not hidden, they are illuminated, made precious. The object becomes more whole because it has been broken, not in spite of it. You see, the teacup is not ruined when it cracks. It is revealed. It finally stops pretending to be perfect, and in that, it becomes something else entirely, honest, unguarded, irreplaceable. You are not so different. There's a river that runs through the heart of all of us, the current of what we did not expect. It carries both joy and undoing, laughter and grief, stillness and shock. When we try to dam it, to name it too quickly, to squeeze it into a tidy plot, we miss it. But when we allow ourselves to float, not drift aimlessly, but yield with curiosity, we begin to feel it, this movement, this pulsing, this shimmer of being that was never meant to be grasped. The river doesn't explain itself, it flows, and so should we. One day you will wake up and not recognize your life. The story you were telling, the one about who you are and where you're going, will have gone quiet. Maybe it will be the result of loss, or love, or simply a moment so still it rearranges everything. You may want to scramble to restore the script, to find your lines. But if you can resist, just for a moment, if you can soften into the silence between what was and what will be, you might notice something. A breath, a flicker, a presence so intimate and wild, you'll wonder how you ever missed it. Chaos is not the absence of meaning. It is the birthplace of new attention. When the child sees the butterfly, they do not ask what it means. They do not narrate its purpose. They are stunned. They reach out, eyes wide, breath held, and then they let it go. That is the whole of it. Contact and release. Beauty and impermanence in one tender exhale. This is not innocence, it is openness. And maybe this is the gift hidden in chaos, that we are returned, however momentarily, to the gaze before the grasp, to the being before the telling, to the moment before the meaning. Zen asks us not to solve the riddle, but to become it, to sit inside the question, to feel the wind change directions and not immediately reach for a weather report, because sometimes the only honest answer is awe, not why did this happen, but how astonishing that I'm still here. The cracked teacup, the falling leaf, the river that turns without warning, all of them whisper the same truth: let go. You were never meant to carry this story so tightly. Let life surprise you. It doesn't knock. It doesn't wait for you to be ready. It doesn't come dressed in explanations or holding the proper credentials. It slips in sideways, through a cracked window, a pause in conversation, a moment you forgot to protect, and suddenly it's there. Beauty, uninvited, unearned, unrepeatable. Not the kind you plan for, not the kind you can frame. The kind that rearranges you without asking. There's a small space between sighing and seeing. That space is where it often enters. A friend once told me a story about sitting on the floor of her apartment, surrounded by unopened bills and broken plans. She had just left a job that gave her ulcers and an identity, and both absences stung. The lights were off, not for ambience, because she hadn't paid the electric bill. And then, in that hollow quiet, she heard the rain. Not on the roof, but on the leaves of the potted plant she had forgotten to water. Each drop a soft drumbeat of being, and somehow, in that ridiculous little moment, she wept. Not because she was sad, but because something so small and so honest had found her when she wasn't performing, when she wasn't pretending to be okay. Sometimes the most astonishing beauty arrives not to affirm your narrative, but to disrupt it. It doesn't resolve your questions, it silences them. There is no technique to summon this kind of grace. That's the koan. It comes precisely when you stop trying, when the effort collapses, when your fists unclench, not in spiritual victory, but in sheer exhaustion. That's when the sky turns a color you didn't know existed. That's when a child on a train platform catches your eye and smiles, not to be polite, but because smiling was the only thing real in that moment. And somehow you smile back, unsure whether you are healing or breaking. And what if those are the same? The cracked teacup holds water still. The falling leaf is not trying to fall beautifully, it just does. There's a wisdom in that uncontrived surrender. a kind of art in becoming unnecessary, beauty without intention. That's the kind that changes you. In Zen, there's a teaching that the most radiant flower is the one blooming alone in the forest, unseen by any eye, praised by no one. Why? Because it's not blooming for admiration. It simply is. Rooted, fleeting, whole. This is not the aesthetic beauty of symmetry or perfection. This is the haunting kind, the one that sneaks in and softens the scaffolding around your heart. What would happen if we stopped trying to capture it? Not every wonder needs to be named. Not every insight needs to be taught. Some things, like the hush that follows a bird's sudden flight, or the exact way your breath slows when you're finally safe, are meant only to be felt once, and then let go. Let go. That's the invitation. Not because beauty is fragile, but because it's free. It doesn't belong to you. You don't need to hold it to receive it. In fact, the moment you try to own it, through language, through repetition, through strategy, it begins to fade. Which is why the child's gaze is so sacred. It sees, and that is enough. It marvels without mastering. It allows the moment to be bigger than its comprehension. You might have noticed that this kind of beauty doesn't solve anything. It doesn't restore your old life. It doesn't make your fears vanish. It just stands there, glowing slightly, like a quiet bell you feel more than hear. And for reasons you can't explain, you bow, not to worship, but to acknowledge. This is the heart of surrender, not collapse, not abandonment, but recognition. You are not steering this river. You never were, but you are being carried. And once in a while, the current offers you a glimpse, not of certainty, but of intimacy. A tree blooming in a war zone, the last sentence of a book that knows your story. A stranger who says nothing, but does not look away. You couldn't have scripted this. And that's the point. Beauty that arrives uninvited is never late. It is the world reminding you, gently, fiercely, that you are not lost, only loosened. Let yourself be loosened. Let yourself be found without seeking. Let yourself be surprised. There is a kind of silence that isn't empty. It doesn't arrive with fanfare or light beams. It doesn't carry answers or insights or even comfort. It simply arrives, or rather, it's been waiting all along beneath the noise you mistook for life. And when it makes itself known, it doesn't feel like peace at first. It feels like absence, like something is missing, like you've been left behind in a room with no instructions and no clock. Silence like that can unnerve you. It can feel like failure, because we're taught, subtly, constantly, that life is supposed to speak, that it's supposed to give us signs, feedback, momentum. We pray and expect a shift. We meditate and expect a mood. We wait for some signal that confirms we're on the right track. But sometimes nothing comes, no insight, no burst of light, just stillness, unyielding, undecorated, impersonal. And that is the moment. That is the threshold. Because what if the silence itself is the teaching? There's a Zen phrase that whispers, "Don't seek the truth, just drop your opinions." But dropping opinions also means dropping expectations about how the sacred should feel, about when the transformation should arrive, about what awakening is supposed to look like. And when you drop all that, really drop it, not as a technique, but out of exhaustion or surrender, something unnameable takes its place. Not a revelation, a pause. It's like standing at the edge of a vast field you didn't know existed. The air is still but not dead. The quiet has a texture. It's not nothing, it's something else. A presence that asks for nothing, demands nothing, just is. In that field you are not being tested. You are not being ignored. You are simply not the center anymore. And strangely, that becomes a kind of relief. There's a story I return to when words feel dry. It's about a monk who sits at the edge of a cliff for 7 years, facing the sea. Every day he watches the waves. Every day he says nothing. One day another traveler approaches and asks, What have you found in all this watching? The monk doesn't answer. He just points to the horizon, not to make a point, but because there was nothing to say. The silence had said it. And maybe that's why silence feels like surprise, because it doesn't perform for us. It doesn't rise to our timelines or soothe our egos. It just waits. Waits until the story you've been telling collapses from its own weight, until your questions soften into wonder, until you're no longer trying to translate everything into meaning, because not everything needs to mean something. Some things just want to be felt, the way mist wraps around a mountain before sunrise, the way your breath moves before your mind interrupts it, the way a room sounds just after someone you love has left it. The Buddhists speak of suchness, the this-ness of what is, untouched by your labels or your preferences. Silence is suchness with its hands folded, not asking you to understand, not needing to be used. Can you bear to be in its company? Can you bear to receive a gift that comes without wrapping, without purpose, without even proof that it was given? Because silence, real silence, doesn't confirm your path. It doesn't give you traction. It gives you nothing, and in that nothing, if you can stay long enough without flinching, a kind of beauty arrives. Not the dramatic kind, the subtle kind, the kind that doesn't try to impress you, the kind that doesn't even call itself beautiful, the cracked teacup on your windowsill that catches morning light just so, the rhythm of your own pulse when you stop trying to be profound, the child across the street spinning in slow circles, not asking why. Silence isn't empty, it's unclaimed. And maybe, just maybe, it's waiting for you to stop trying to make it speak, so you can finally listen. And yet, silence doesn't just ask for your attention. It begins to undo your assumptions. There's something subversive in the way nothing happens, in the way you stare at a candle flame, waiting for insight, and instead find yourself noticing the way shadows shift on the wall, or how your breath, that old, unnoticed friend, rises and falls without any choreography. There is no mantra, no verse, no guidance, only this being, and in that being a strange thing stirs, not clarity, exactly, but a loosening. The grip around your mind, all those plans, labels, purposes, begins to soften. You forget for just a moment who you were supposed to be. And oddly, it doesn't feel like loss. It feels like the first honest breath you've taken in years. The child's gaze returns, not because you summoned it, but because you forgot to resist. And in the lull, in the delicate hush that follows your final why, you are met by a presence so quiet it could be mistaken for absence. But look again, that stillness is alive, not with answers, but with permission. Permission to stop, to let it be, to stop fixing, naming, seeking, to be a cracked teacup, light slipping through a fracture you once tried to hide, to be the river not racing to the sea, but swaying gently against its own edge, to be the falling leaf, not asking where it will land. There's an old Zen saying, when the mind is at peace, the world too is at peace. It sounds poetic until you realize it's not a metaphor. When your mind is no longer chasing, the world does, in fact, stop spinning, not literally, but intimately. The noise fades, the pulse of things slows, and then, astonishingly, life begins to speak again. Not in sentences, but a bird calls, a chair creaks. Your spine tingles with the sudden awareness that you are alive, and you do not know why. That unknowing isn't a problem, it's a doorway. When you finally let silence be silence, when you stop asking it to teach or to heal or to prove, something stirs within it, a shimmering presence. Not quite seen, not quite heard, but real. Like watching the fog lift and realizing the mountain was there all along. This is the surprise that cannot be staged. It arrives without your story. It doesn't need your interpretation. It doesn't solve anything, but it touches something underneath your explanations. And that touch, light, almost unnoticeable, rewrites you. You become less concerned with where you're going, more attuned to where you are, less invested in the plot of your life, more curious about the texture of this moment. And in that subtle shift, you realize surrender wasn't the end. It was the opening. When nothing arrives, something deeper begins. Not a doctrine, not a miracle, just a quiet yes. And maybe, just maybe, this is the most disorienting miracle of all, that nothing is missing. Not because everything is perfect, but because perfection was never the point. The silence didn't bring the answer you were hoping for, but it brought something else, an intimacy with the unspeakable. You're not at the center of the universe, but you're undeniably part of its unfolding, not the one pulling the strings, but the string itself, vibrating with the tremble of the wind. In that realization, there is no conclusion, just presence, no revelation to chase, no narrative to finish, just a leaf falling and the hush that follows. There is a kind of stillness that we often mistake for failure. It arrives not with clarity, but with the end of striving, not with peace. Exactly, at least not the peace we usually bargain for, but with the soft hush that follows exhaustion. It's the moment after you've stopped trying to make the river flow backward, after the map is soaked and torn, and you no longer know where north is, after every story you told yourself about who you should be finally loses its urgency. It feels empty at first, not a holy silence, but a bewildering absence. An emptiness that doesn't congratulate you for being brave or offer you a vision board of what comes next. It just is. It asks nothing. It doesn't care how long you sit, or what you do next, or how evolved your awareness has become. Stillness that doesn't seek is not the prize at the end of your unraveling. It is the unraveling, finally unresisted. One morning, I watched a crow land on the bare branch outside my window. It didn't caw, preen, or look around dramatically, the way crows often do. It simply perched, nothing special, and yet I found myself weeping. Not from sadness, not from joy either, but from the way the moment had no edges, no moral, no achievement, no plot. That crow was not trying to be a symbol. It wasn't performing peace. It wasn't doing mindfulness. It just was. And somehow that just was cracked something open. I've spent years trying to orchestrate moments like that. Retreats, practices, books, rituals, all elegant disguises for my craving to replicate a feeling I didn't yet understand. But real stillness won't be coaxed or managed or packaged into an experience. It doesn't reward effort. It doesn't bloom under pressure. Stillness that doesn't seek comes when seeking gets too heavy to carry. There's a koan that says, "Don't draw another head on top of your own." It's easy to think it's about humility or ego or Zen cleverness, but sit with it long enough, and it starts to whisper something simpler: you already are what you keep trying to become. When you finally stop dressing the moment in your expectations, it slips, naked and shining, into your lap. No thunder, no angels, just this: a coffee cup cooling beside your hand, the faint hum of the refrigerator, a bird flapping somewhere in the trees, the particular ache behind your right eye, and inside all of it, no conclusion, just breath, just being. We're taught to associate stillness with clarity, with vision, with becoming someone more realized. But what if real stillness doesn't make you feel wiser, or more spiritual, or more at peace? What if it just makes you feel nothing? Not the empty kind of nothing, the spacious kind, the kind that doesn't grasp, the kind that leaves room for everything without needing to name it. It is a relief so quiet, most of us miss it entirely. There is no lightning bolt. There is no triumphant transformation montage, just the relief of not being in control, the exquisite simplicity of no longer needing to pretend otherwise. And perhaps this is where surrender stops being a gesture and becomes a home. Not the place you end up after fixing yourself, but the place you return to when there's nothing left to fix. when even the act of letting go is let go of. Some people think awakening feels like being lifted out of the world. But what if it's the opposite? What if awakening is the gentle return to the weight of your own body, to the wind on your neck, to the softness behind your eyes as you look without reaching? Stillness is not a promise. It does not say, "No, you will be calm forever." It only says, you don't need to run anymore. And in that pause, in that sacred, unremarkable pause, life reveals herself again. Not as a teacher, not as a lesson, just as herself, unfolding, unbeckoned, beautiful beyond explanation, because it has nothing to prove. You may forget it tomorrow. You may chase again, that's okay. Stillness will be here when you return, not waiting, just here. There is something ancient and unsentimental about the way a river moves. It doesn't ask for permission to shift its course. It doesn't explain when it overflows or carves into rock. It simply follows the pull of gravity, yielding and persistent, soft and unstoppable. You can fight it, of course. Try to dam it, contain it, chart its turns. But eventually, if you're quiet long enough, you might hear what the river has been whispering all along. I already know the way, and that's when things begin to soften. I remember standing at the edge of a stream in the early days of what I thought was a breakdown, but turned out to be a quiet kind of beginning. I had come there with questions, big about purpose, about love, about what comes next. But the water didn't answer in words, it answered in motion, in its refusal to freeze for my certainty. It just kept flowing as if to say, you don't have to know. You only have to let go. I didn't believe it, not fully. Not at first. We're trained to admire the swimmer, the builder, the one who makes things happen. And yet the river, the very current that holds everything, never pushes. It curves. It disappears behind rocks and reappears miles later with the same quiet insistence. Keep moving, even if you don't understand. The most disorienting wisdom isn't loud. It doesn't come wrapped in fireworks or insight. It comes when your strategies fail, when you stop mapping the future and just stand there, confused and still and alive. Surrender isn't always a dramatic gesture. Sometimes it's letting yourself cry in the middle of a grocery store aisle for no obvious reason. Sometimes it's saying, I don't know, and meaning it. Sometimes it's canceling your plans because your body is asking you to rest. And sometimes it's just sitting by the river, listening without needing to translate. What if the current is not against you, but you've been swimming upstream? There's an old Zen saying, no snowflake ever falls in the wrong place. It sounds romantic, maybe even naive, until you live through a moment where everything falls apart and somehow you're still here, breath in your chest, dirt under your fingernails, some unseen current, carrying you forward even when you've stopped trying. I once watched a branch caught in the river after a storm. At first, it thrashed wildly, spinning and catching against rocks. But eventually, slowly, it aligned with the current. It didn't sink. It didn't rush. It floated with a strange dignity, letting the water take the lead. It was that image, not a quote, not a sermon, that taught me surrender isn't collapse. It's alignment. It's trust without needing proof. This is what the river teaches if you stop yelling at it. You begin to feel the difference between control and participation. Control says, I decide where we're going. Participation says, I'll be present wherever this takes me. One clenches, the other opens. One resists, the other learns to dance. Sometimes life will ask you to float through dark water, through uncertainty, through grief, through the disorientation of no longer being who you once were. But the river does not forget its destination, even when you do. It knows the way through eddies, through still pools, through rapids that leave your breath ragged. And if you can stop gripping long enough, you may discover that you're not lost. You're simply in a part of the river you don't recognize yet. No one ever taught the river how to find the ocean. It just kept moving. And maybe you don't need a master plan. Maybe you don't need all the answers. Maybe what you need is to stop paddling in fear and let the water show you what comes next. You're not failing. You're flowing. There's a strange quiet that descends after you've tried everything. Not the quiet of defeat, though it might feel like that at first. Not the quiet of transcendence either. That word's too clean. More like the hush that follows exhaustion, when even your striving gets tired of itself. When the hand that tried to hold it all together falls open. Not from wisdom, but from weariness. And somehow, that's where it begins. You don't even notice it at first. Just a subtle shift, like light changing at dusk. You stop resisting not because you figured it out, but because there's no one left inside you to keep the fight going. All the identities, the fix-it strategies, the spiritual personas, even the hunger to become better, they dissolve like mist burned off by morning sun, and in their place, an unexpected spaciousness. Nothing to do, no one to be, no one left to let go. What's left is just awareness, unclenched, unnamed. I remember a moment, not dramatic, not even particularly poetic. I was standing at the sink, washing a cracked teacup I'd once intended to repair, but never did. And for reasons I still can't explain, I stopped mid-motion and just looked at it. This broken, chipped little thing still capable of holding warmth. Something inside me cracked too, and into that crack flowed something quieter than thought. Not a message, not an insight, just presence. For a flicker of a moment, I wasn't trying to fix anything. Not the cup, not the past, not myself. The absence of striving felt strange, disorienting, like I was forgetting how to be someone. But it wasn't scary. It was tender, like being held by something that didn't need me to improve or perform. Like being met by the world in exactly the state I was in, undone, unfinished, and fully seen. And then the teacup was just a teacup again. But I'd changed. We often think letting go is something we do, a technique, a decision. But what if it's not? What if true surrender isn't an action, but the falling away of the actor? What if the self that struggles to release is the same self being released? The old Zen masters didn't teach by explanation. They taught by breaking the mind's grip. Show me your original face before your parents were born. What could you possibly say to that? It's not a question to be answered. It's a mirror, one that cracks every story you've been telling yourself. Because once there's no one left inside insisting on holding everything together, life rushes in. Not as a concept, as breath, as sound, as birdsong you somehow hear for the first time, even though it's been there all along. You see, there's a quiet revolution in not knowing, in not being the knower, in allowing the moment to arise without placing yourself at the center of it. Try this: sit outside, eyes open, and listen without labeling. Notice what happens when the mind searches for meaning, and what happens when it doesn't. The wind doesn't call itself wind. The crow doesn't need your understanding. And maybe you don't need fixing after all. I once met a woman who told me she stopped meditating after 20 years because it had become another self-improvement project. I realized I was still trying to escape myself, she said. Even my silence was performative. But one day, she sat down and didn't try to meditate, didn't try to empty her mind. She just breathed, just sat, and in that not doing, something shifted. The watcher vanished. She said she felt like the earth was breathing her. This is what happens when the river no longer believes it must chart the course, when the leaf no longer resists the fall, when the wave recognizes it was never separate from the ocean. You begin to live not as the story, but as the space it unfolds within. There's no epiphany, no grand finale, just a soft landing, a stillness that doesn't seek, a letting go that happens on its own, like sleep, like love, like dusk slipping into night. And in that stillness, everything remains. The pain, the joy, the undone laundry, the cracked teacup. But nothing owns you, because the one who was trying to hold it all together has quietly stepped aside. And the river, ever patient, carries on. You were taught, perhaps without words, that having a map meant you'd be safe. That if you just followed the lines carefully, success, love, discipline, spirituality, you could avoid getting lost. But no one tells you that the map is not the terrain, that by the time you finish charting the path, the landscape has already changed, the mountain has shifted, the river has rerouted, and you are no longer the same traveler who started the journey. At some point, you will stand on a quiet threshold with nothing in your hands, no plans, no answers, no coordinates left to trace, and it won't feel like triumph. It will feel like vertigo. This is the final koan. What do you do when there's nothing left to do? I once met an old monk who said, "The moment I stopped needing to arrive, I realized I had never left." He smiled like someone who knew something unteachable. Then he handed me a stone, warm from his palm, and said nothing else. I still carry that stone, not for guidance, for remembering. Farewell to the map is not a moment of abandonment. It's a moment of reunion with the terrain, with the mystery, with your own unknowing. There's a peculiar relief in letting go of even your most sacred systems, even your spiritual tools. Because eventually, even truth becomes heavy if you hold it too long. This isn't the collapse of certainty, it's its soft decay, a shedding, like the snake who doesn't analyze its skin before it lets it go, like the leaf that doesn't negotiate with gravity. We spend so much of life reaching for understanding, for peace, for arrival. But what if there is no there? What if the beauty wasn't in getting anywhere, but in the way your heart was reshaped by trying? Letting go of control isn't the end of structure, it's the beginning of relationship. With chaos, with ambiguity, with what arises when you no longer insist on being the narrator of your own experience. It's not passivity, it's an alert kind of surrender, like standing barefoot in a thunderstorm with your arms open. It's here with no map in your hand and no promise in the sky that you begin to sense the quiet intelligence of things. The way the wind seems to know where to go. The way your breath keeps arriving, even when you forget to summon it. Have you ever watched a child wander in a garden, not looking for anything? Just touching petals, chasing shadows, losing and finding themselves again in the same moment? That's not ignorance. That's the deepest kind of wisdom, the willingness to be in life, not above it. The final freedom is not transcendence, it's transparency. To be so open that life moves through you without resistance. To be so empty of strategies that wonder becomes your native language again. To weep at the crack in the teacup not out of sentiment, but reverence. Because you've stopped fixing the cracks. You've started honoring them. In one Zen story, a student asks the master, "What is the way?" The master replies, "Your everyday mind, that is the way." The student presses, "Should I try to direct myself toward it?" The master says, "If you try for it, you will become separated from it. No map, no method, just this." You may feel the temptation to pick the map back up, to give shape to the formless, to explain to others how you got here. But the deeper truth is, you didn't. The path walked you, the river carried you, the letting go did the letting go. There's no one left behind the curtain now, just breath, just sound, just the stillness that once terrified you, now offering its lap like a mother. What remains is presence, raw, luminous, and entirely unheld. And maybe that was the point all along.